Princess Zarath of the Velkarian Empire had always been told that humans were a peculiar species, soft-bodied, short-lived, and remarkably fragile compared to most galactic civilizations. When she first met David Chen at the diplomatic reception on Nexus Station, she found these observations to be entirely accurate. David stood barely 6 feet tall, which made him shorter than most Velkarians by at least 2 feet. His skin lacked the natural armor plating that protected her people, and his movements seemed almost gentle, lacking the sharp, predatory grace of warriors. When he smiled at her across the crowded reception hall, his teeth were small and flat, nothing like the razor-sharp fangs that marked apex predators throughout the galaxy. "Your Highness," he had said, offering a slight bow that seemed more respectful than submissive. "I'm David Chen, the Human Cultural Attaché. Thank you for agreeing to this meeting." Zarath had studied him with her large, golden eyes. Humans were new to the galactic community, having only achieved faster-than-light travel 30 years ago. Most species took centuries to develop such technology. The rapid advancement had made many governments nervous, but David seemed like living proof that humans posed no threat to anyone. He spoke softly, chose his words carefully, and when she mentioned her interest in human literature, his face lit up with genuine enthusiasm. They spent hours discussing poetry, philosophy, and the strange human concept of jazz music. David's passion for learning about other cultures was infectious, and Zarath found herself genuinely enjoying his company. Over the following months, their diplomatic meetings became personal conversations. David would bring small gifts, pressed flowers from Earth, recordings of human music, handwritten poems he had translated into Velkarian script. He never pushed for more than she was willing to give, never demanded her time or attention. In a life full of ambitious suitors seeking political advantage, David's genuine interest in her thoughts and opinions was refreshing. Her father, Emperor Kethvar, was less impressed. "This human is weak," he declared during one of their private dinners. "Look at his genetic profile. No natural weapons, no protective shells, no enhanced strength. His species has no significant military achievements. What could he possibly offer the future Empress of Velkaria?" Zarath had defended David quietly but firmly. "He offers kindness, father. Intelligence, a different perspective on the galaxy." "Kindness," her father had repeated, making the word sound like a disease. "The Velkarian Empire was not built on kindness, daughter. When the Zephyrian raiders come for our outer colonies, when the Hive Collective tests our borders, will this human's kindness protect our people?" Despite her father's objections, Zarath found herself falling in love with David's gentle nature. He would spend hours in the palace gardens with her, pointing out the similarities between Earth and Velkarian flowers. He learned to prepare traditional Velkarian meals, though his human taste buds couldn't handle the spice levels that her people considered mild. When she was stressed from court politics, he would play soft melodies on his guitar, filling her chambers with music that seemed to calm her very soul. Their wedding was a modest affair by royal standards. Emperor Kethvar allowed it, perhaps hoping that having a human prince consort would strengthen diplomatic ties with Earth's growing influence in the galaxy. David looked small and almost fragile in his ceremonial robes, standing beside Zarath's imposing figure as they exchanged vows according to both Velkarian and human traditions. The early months of their marriage were the happiest of Zarath's life. David adapted to palace life with remarkable ease, though he never lost his humble, gentle nature. He would wake her each morning with Earth coffee, a stimulant that had become her secret addiction, and read her passages from human poetry. In the evenings, they would walk through the royal gardens while he told her stories about Earth, about the blue oceans and green forests that sounded like paradise. David's presence in the palace had a calming effect on everyone around him. The usually stern royal guards found themselves smiling when he greeted them by name each morning. The kitchen staff fought over who would prepare his meals, delighted by his genuine appreciation for their efforts. Even the court advisors, who had initially viewed him with suspicion, began seeking his opinions on cultural matters. "Your husband is surprisingly insightful," Admiral Thexron told Zarath one afternoon. "His suggestions for the diplomatic protocols with the Andorian Federation were quite valuable. He has a way of seeing through cultural barriers that I had not expected." Zarath felt a warm pride at the compliment. David had a gift for understanding people, for finding common ground between different species. He spent his days studying Valkyrian history and law, not because anyone demanded it of him, but because he genuinely wanted to be helpful to her people. The only area where David seemed completely out of his element was during military briefings. When Admiral Thexron discussed fleet movements or defensive strategies, David would listen politely but contribute nothing. His discomfort with violence was obvious to everyone in the room. Once, when the Admiral described a successful raid against Zephyrian pirates, David had actually looked sick. "Humans are pacifists," the Admiral explained to Zarath later. "It's well documented. Their species has an unusual aversion to necessary violence. They've never fought a proper war against another spacefaring species." This observation seemed to be confirmed by David's behavior during their first year of marriage. When palace guards practiced combat drills in the courtyard, David would find excuses to be elsewhere. He avoided the weapons displays in the royal armory and changed the subject whenever military matters came up in conversation. Zarath found his gentleness endearing, though she sometimes worried about how he would handle the more brutal realities of ruling an empire. David's human friends who visited the palace only reinforced these impressions. Ambassador Sarah Liu was a soft-spoken diplomat who preferred negotiation to confrontation. Dr. James Wright, a xenobiologist, was fascinated by alien life forms, but squeamish about even the most minor medical procedures on Valkyrian physiology. Captain Maria Santos, despite her military rank, commanded an exploration vessel rather than a warship, and seemed more interested in cataloging new star systems than conquering them. "Humans are remarkable," David explained to Zarath one evening as they watched the sunset from their balcony. "Not because we're the strongest or the fastest, but because we've learned to solve problems through cooperation instead of conquest. We've had to, really. We're pretty fragile compared to most species out there." Zarath had smiled at his modesty. Her husband was proof that strength came in many forms. His quiet wisdom had already prevented 2 potential diplomatic incidents, and his gentle nature was slowly changing the harsh culture of the Valkyrian court for the better. Life in the palace settled into a comfortable routine. David would rise early to tend the small earth garden he had planted in a corner of the royal grounds. Zarath would find him there most mornings, carefully watering tomato plants and herb gardens that somehow thrived in Valkyria's alien soil. He would talk to the plants as he worked, something he claimed improved their growth, but which she suspected was simply part of his gentle nature. Their evenings were spent in quiet conversation, reading or listening to music from both their worlds. David had introduced her to human art forms she had never imagined, poetry that rhymed, music with no discernible battle rhythms, paintings that depicted peaceful scenes instead of glorious victories. In return, she shared Valkyrian literature and music, though she noticed he preferred the less aggressive traditional pieces to the martial hymns that stirred her people's blood. The royal court gradually accepted David's presence, though many still viewed him as a curiosity rather than a true member of the imperial family. Children in the palace followed him around, fascinated by his strange appearance and gentle demeanor. He would tell them stories from Earth, tales of heroes who won through cleverness rather than strength, of conflicts resolved through understanding rather than violence. Uncle David, as the royal children had begun calling him, was unlike any adult they had known. He never raised his voice, never spoke harshly, and seemed genuinely interested in their thoughts and feelings. When young Prince Kextar scraped his knee during play, David had carefully cleaned and bandaged the wound with a gentleness that amazed the child's Velcarian caregivers. Zarath often watched these interactions with growing love for her husband. David possessed qualities that Velcarian culture didn't traditionally value, but which she was beginning to realize might be exactly what her people needed. His influence was subtle but undeniable. Conflicts between court factions seemed to resolve more peacefully when David was involved in discussions. Diplomatic negotiations proceeded more smoothly when he was present to offer cultural insights. Even Emperor Kethvar began to show grudging respect for his son-in-law, though he still questioned David's fitness for royal life. "The human has merit," he admitted to Zarath during one of their weekly meetings. His suggestions regarding the trade agreements with the Centauri Republic were surprisingly astute. However, I remained concerned about his softness. A ruler must sometimes make hard choices. Zarath understood her father's concerns, but she believed that David's compassion was a strength, not a weakness. In their private moments, when they lay together in the darkness of their chambers, David would tell her about his dreams for the future. He spoke of a galaxy where conflicts were resolved through understanding, where technology was used to help rather than harm, where different species could learn from each other instead of fighting over territory and resources. These dreams seemed impossibly idealistic to someone raised in the Velcarian tradition of strength through conquest, but David's genuine belief in them was infectious. Zarath found herself imagining a different kind of empire, one built on cooperation rather than fear. With David at her side, such dreams almost seemed possible. As their first year of marriage drew to a close, Zarath felt more content than she had ever been. David had brought peace and gentleness into her life, qualities she had never known she was missing. He had shown her that there were other ways to be strong, other ways to lead, other ways to live. She had no way of knowing that this peaceful existence was about to end, and that the gentle human she had fallen in love with was about to reveal aspects of his nature that would shake the very foundations of the Velcarian Empire. The first sign of trouble came during what should have been a routine diplomatic dinner. The Krexthai delegation had arrived that morning, their beetle-like forms clicking across the polished floors of the palace in their ceremonial armor. Zarath had hosted dozens of such gatherings, but something felt different about this one from the moment the aliens entered the Great Hall. Ambassador Vorthak, the Krexthai leader, was larger than most of his species, his chitinous exoskeleton bearing the scars of numerous battles. His forearms moved in complex gestures as he spoke, and his compound eyes seemed to take in every detail of the palace's defenses. When introduced to David, the ambassador's mandibles clicked in what Zarath recognized as barely concealed amusement. "So this is the famous human prince," Vorthak said, his voice carrying the harsh buzzing undertone common to his species. "I had heard humans were smaller than expected." David offered his usual diplomatic smile, extending his hand in the human greeting gesture. "Ambassador Vorthak, welcome to Velcaria. I hope your journey was comfortable." Vorthak ignored the offered hand, instead circling David slowly like a predator examining prey. "Comfortable, yes. Though I must say, I expected the Imperial Palace to be more heavily guarded. Your security seems relaxed." Emperor Kethvar's golden eyes narrowed, but his voice remained diplomatically neutral. "The Velcarian Empire has little to fear from any who would visit us in peace. Ambassador." "Of course," Vorthak replied, his attention still focused on David. "Though I wonder what role this human plays in your military preparations. Surely someone married to the heir to the throne must have some martial training?" David's discomfort was obvious as he shifted slightly behind Zarath. "I'm more involved in cultural and diplomatic affairs, Ambassador. I leave military matters to those far more qualified than myself." The Krextai delegation exchanged rapid clicks and buzzes in their native language. Zarath's translation device picked up fragments: soft shell, no weapons, vulnerability. Throughout the dinner, Ambassador Vorthak continued his subtle probing. He asked detailed questions about palace security protocols, fleet positions, and defensive capabilities. Most disturbing was his persistent focus on David, asking about human military traditions, combat training, and something he called warrior awakening rituals. "Humans are peaceful by nature," David explained patiently for the third time. "We prefer to resolve conflicts through negotiation and compromise." "How fascinating," Vorthak replied, his mandibles clicking rapidly. "And this peaceful nature extends to defending your family, your mate?" David's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I believe there are always alternatives to violence, Ambassador." After the delegation retired for the evening, Zarath found David standing on their balcony, staring out at the palace gardens. His shoulders were tense, and she could see the stress in the way he gripped the stone railing. "The Krextai made you uncomfortable," she observed, moving to stand beside him. "Something isn't right about this visit," David said quietly. "The questions they were asking, the way they were studying the palace layout. This feels more like reconnaissance than diplomacy." Admiral Thexeron had reached the same conclusion. He requested an emergency meeting the next morning, his usual composed demeanor replaced by obvious concern. "The Krextai delegation has been conducting unauthorized scans of our defensive systems," he reported. "Our security detected 3 separate attempts to access classified military databases." Emperor Kethavar's claws extended slightly, a sign of his growing anger. "What are their intentions?" "Unknown, Your Majesty, but their fleet movements suggest preparation for something significant. Intelligence reports show Krextai forces massing near our border systems." David had remained silent during the briefing, but Zarath noticed how carefully he was studying the tactical displays. His usual discomfort with military matters seemed overshadowed by something else, a focused intensity she had never seen before. The situation deteriorated rapidly over the following days. More Krextai ships appeared in neutral space near Velkarian territory. Trade vessels reported being escorted by Krextai patrols, and several diplomatic communications to the Krextai High Command went unanswered. Ambassador Vorthak, meanwhile, continued his diplomatic charade while clearly gathering intelligence. He requested tours of the palace's historical artifacts, which happened to be stored near sensitive communication equipment. He expressed interest in the royal gardens, which provided clear sightlines to the spaceport. His questions about Velkarian culture invariably led to discussions of military traditions and defensive capabilities. David's behavior during this time puzzled Zarath. Instead of his usual avoidance of military matters, he began asking quiet questions about palace security. He studied maps of the building layout and seemed particularly interested in evacuation procedures. When she asked him about this new interest, he simply said he wanted to be prepared to help if needed. "I may not be a warrior," he told her one evening as they prepared for sleep, "but I won't be completely useless if something happens." 3 days after the delegation's arrival, the crisis began in earnest. Zarath was attending a cultural presentation by the Krextai when alerts began flashing on Admiral Thexeron's communication device. He excused himself quietly, but Zarath could see the alarm in his expression. Within minutes, palace guards were moving through the halls with increased urgency. The presentation ended abruptly when Emperor Kethavar was called away for an emergency council session. Ambassador Vorthak watched these developments with obvious satisfaction, his compound eyes glittering with predatory anticipation. The truth became clear during the hastily convened emergency meeting. A massive Krextai fleet had emerged from hyperspace directly at the edge of the Velcarian system, demanding the immediate surrender of the outer colonies and threatening full invasion if their demands were not met within 12 hours. This was planned from the beginning, Admiral Thexron reported grimly. The diplomatic mission was a cover for intelligence gathering. They now know our defensive positions, response times, and fleet deployments. Emperor Kethvar's rage was terrible to behold, his normally controlled demeanor cracking to reveal the warrior underneath. How dare they abuse diplomatic immunity to plan an attack? Ready our fleets for immediate deployment. The main fleet requires 18 hours minimum to reach defensive positions, the admiral replied. They timed this perfectly. We'll be fighting at a severe disadvantage. Throughout the meeting, David sat quietly, listening to reports of Krextai troop movements and fleet positions. Zarath noticed that he was taking careful notes and studying the tactical displays with an intensity that surprised her. When Admiral Thexron mentioned vulnerable civilian populations on the outer worlds, David's hand tightened around his stylus hard enough that she heard it crack. After the meeting, as the royal family and senior advisors dispersed to manage the crisis, Ambassador Vorthak approached them with his delegation. His earlier pretense of diplomatic courtesy had vanished, replaced by open hostility. Emperor Kethvar, he said with mock formality, my government has asked me to deliver a final message. Surrender your outer systems peacefully, and the Krextai hegemony will allow the core worlds to maintain limited autonomy. Refuse, and we will take everything by force. The Velcarian Empire does not negotiate with pirates and invaders, Kethvar replied, his voice deadly quiet. Vorthak's mandibles clicked in amusement. Empire? You are barely a dozen worlds held together by tradition and outdated honor codes. The galaxy is changing, old Emperor. Species like yours, who cling to ancient ways, will be swept aside by those with the wisdom to embrace conquest. His gaze shifted to David with obvious contempt. And allying yourselves with humans, soft, weak creatures who fear their own shadows. This only proves how far the mighty Velcarians have fallen. Zarath felt her own anger rising at the insult to her husband, but David himself seemed strangely calm. Ambassador, he said quietly, I think you should return to your ship. Vorthak moved closer, looming over David's smaller form. Or what, little human? Will you file a diplomatic protest? Perhaps write a strongly worded letter to my government? The Krextai delegation found this hilarious, their chittering laughter echoing through the chamber. David stood his ground, but Zarath could see him trembling slightly. She assumed it was fear, which only made her more protective of her gentle husband. David's right, she said, stepping forward. This conversation is over. Palace guards will escort you to your ship immediately. Of course, Vorthak replied with mock courtesy. But before we go, I have one final gift for the human prince. He gestured to one of his subordinates, who activated a holographic display. The image showed a human colony ship, one of the small settlements that Earth had established near Velcarian space. Zarath recognized it as New Geneva, a peaceful agricultural world with fewer than 50,000 inhabitants. A Krextai patrol discovered this little nest earlier today, Vorthak explained casually. Such a fragile species, humans. One wonders how they would fare if their atmospheric processors were to malfunction. The implication was clear, and Zarath saw David's face go completely pale. New Geneva was home to families, children, elderly colonists who had never harmed anyone. The Krextai were threatening to commit genocide against his people. You wouldn't dare, David whispered, his voice barely audible. Wouldn't I? Vorthak leaned closer, his breath hissing against David's face. 12 hours, human. If the Velcarian Empire has not surrendered by then, New Geneva dies. And then we'll visit every other human world we can find. For a moment, David seemed frozen, staring at the holographic image of the peaceful colony. Zarath reached for him, wanting to comfort her husband, but stopped when she saw his eyes. Something was wrong. The gentle, compassionate expression she knew so well was gone, replaced by something she had never seen before. David's hands had stopped trembling, and his breathing had become slow and controlled. Most disturbing was his stillness. The natural, relaxed movements that characterized him had been replaced by an absolute predatory motionlessness. When David finally spoke, his voice was different. Quiet, but carrying an undertone of controlled violence that made even Vorthok take an involuntary step backward. 12 hours, David repeated, his eyes never leaving the Krexthai ambassador's face. That should be enough. Zarath felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with fear for their enemies. Zarath had never seen David move with such purpose. After the Krexthai delegation departed for their ships, he disappeared into their chambers and emerged 20 minutes later, carrying a sealed case she had never seen before. Gone was the gentle, uncertain demeanor she had grown to love. In its place was someone she barely recognized, focused, controlled, and radiating a cold efficiency that made the palace guard step aside without being asked. "David," she called as he strode toward the communications center. "What are you doing?" "Making a call," he replied without slowing down. His voice carried the same strange undertone that had appeared during his confrontation with Vorthok, quiet, but somehow more dangerous than any shouting. Emperor Kethvar found them in the communications room where David was establishing an encrypted connection to what appeared to be a human military frequency. "Prince David, this is no time for diplomatic channels. The human colonial government cannot provide military assistance in 12 hours. David's fingers moved across the alien control systems with surprising expertise, adapting human encryption protocols to Velkarian technology in ways that shouldn't have been possible for someone without advanced technical training. "I'm not contacting the colonial government, Your Majesty." The holographic display flickered to life, revealing a stern-faced woman in what was unmistakably a military uniform. Her rank insignia was unfamiliar to Zarath, but the authority in her bearing was unmistakable. "Ghost Actual, this is an unsecured line," the woman said without preamble. "I know, Colonel Santos. Emergency extraction needed for New Geneva colony, full civilian population, threat level Alpha." Zarath's mind reeled. Ghost Actual? This was not the David she knew, the gentleman who avoided military discussions and flinched at violence. "Copy that. What's the timeline?" 11 hours, 47 minutes, David replied, checking his timepiece with mechanical precision. "Hostile fleet in position to deploy atmospheric toxins. Population has no defensive capabilities." "Understood. Phoenix Squadron is 3 hours out from New Geneva. We'll implement Protocol 7. "Negative," David said sharply. "Protocol 7 requires acceptable losses. This is Protocol 0. Even through the hologram, Zarath could see Colonel Santos's expression change. "Sir, Protocol 0 hasn't been authorized for—" "I'm authorizing it. Full deployment, all assets, no restrictions." "Copy that, Ghost Actual. Phoenix, Valkyrie, and Reaper squadrons responding. ETA 7 hours to target zone." The connection ended, leaving the communications room in stunned silence. Emperor Kethvar was the first to speak, his voice carefully controlled. "Prince David, perhaps you could explain what just transpired." David turned to face them, and Zarath saw that his eyes held the same predatory stillness she had glimpsed earlier. "The human colonies maintain an unofficial defense force, small, specialized units trained for extreme circumstances." "And you have authority over this force?" Admiral Thexron asked, having arrived during the transmission. "I helped create it." David's answer was simple, but the implications were staggering. The early human colonies were extremely vulnerable. Pirates, raiders, hostile species who saw us as easy targets. The official human government preferred diplomatic solutions, but diplomacy doesn't work when your enemies see you as prey. He opened the case he had brought, revealing equipment that Zarath had never seen before. Military-grade communication devices, tactical analysis tools, and what appeared to be advanced weapons components, all human technology, but clearly military rather than civilian. So we developed alternative solutions, David continued, assembling the equipment with practiced efficiency. Small teams, advanced training, unconventional tactics. Most of the galaxy sees humans as weak because we let them see what we want them to see. Zarath felt as though she was discovering her husband was a complete stranger. "You've been lying to me. To all of us." David paused in his work, and for a moment she saw a glimpse of the gentle man she had fallen in love with. "No, Zarath, I've been exactly who you thought I was, the David who brings you coffee every morning, who reads you poetry, who tends the garden. That's real. But I'm also this." He activated one of the devices, and tactical displays sprang to life around the room. Fleet positions, weapon capabilities, defensive analyses, all focused on the Krextai forces threatening both Velcaria and New Geneva. "The Krextai made a serious miscalculation," David said, his voice returning to that cold, professional tone. "They assumed that because humans avoid conflict, we're incapable of it. They're about to learn the difference." Over the next several hours, Zarath watched her husband orchestrate a military operation with a skill that rivaled Admiral Thexron's. He coordinated with human units she had never heard of, analyzed Krextai tactical patterns with frightening accuracy, and demonstrated a knowledge of military strategy that seemed impossible for someone who had spent the past year avoiding weapons training. "The Krextai rely on overwhelming force and intimidation," he explained to the assembled Velcarian command staff. "They've never faced an opponent who uses misdirection and precision strikes. Their formations are optimized for conventional warfare, which makes them vulnerable to asymmetric tactics." "And humans specialize in asymmetric tactics?" Admiral Thexron asked. David's smile was nothing like the gentle expressions Zarath was used to seeing. "Admiral, my species fought itself for thousands of years before we reached the stars. We've had a lot of practice at finding creative ways to kill things that are bigger and stronger than we are." As the deadline approached, David received regular updates from his mysterious military contacts. Human ships were moving into position around New Geneva, but they were unlike any vessels in the official human colonial fleet. These craft were smaller, faster, and according to the sensor readings, heavily armed with weapons that didn't appear in any galactic military database. "Where did these ships come from?" Zarath asked as she watched the tactical display. "Officially, they don't exist," David replied. "The human government maintains plausible deniability about our defensive capabilities. It's easier to let other species underestimate us." 3 hours before the Krextai deadline, the first reports came in from New Geneva. The human evacuation ships had arrived and were extracting civilians at an impossible speed. But instead of simply fleeing, they were implementing what David called adaptive defense. The Krextai patrol that had been threatening the colony found itself facing opponents unlike anything in their experience. Human ships that appeared defenseless suddenly revealed hidden weapons systems. Vessels that seemed to be fleeing led Krextai pursuers into carefully prepared ambushes. Most disturbing for the attackers, the humans were using tactics that bordered on the incomprehensible. "They're running," Admiral Vorthak reported to the main Krextai fleet. "But they're running in patterns that don't make sense. Our pursuit ships keep losing them in regions of space where hiding should be impossible." What the Krextai didn't understand was that humans had spent centuries perfecting the art of asymmetric warfare. Their ships used gravitational slingshots, electromagnetic interference, and sensor spoofing in ways that turned the laws of physics into weapons. Where other species saw empty space, humans saw opportunities for ambush and misdirection. By the time the main Krextai fleet realized they were no longer hunting helpless colonists, but fighting a coordinated military force, it was too late. Human ships emerged from seemingly impossible hiding places, striking with precision at critical systems before vanishing again. The Krextai formation, designed to intimidate through overwhelming presence, became a liability as their own ships blocked each other's firing solutions. "This is impossible," Vorthak transmitted to his fleet. "Their ships are too small to carry these weapons. Their crews are too few to execute these maneuvers." David, monitoring the battle from the Velcarian command center, allowed himself a small, cold smile. "That's the point, Ambassador. You never understood what you were really threatening." The turning point came when the human ships revealed their most devastating capability. Instead of engaging the Krextai fleet directly, they began targeting the environmental systems of the attacking ships. Krextai vessels, designed for aggressive offense, had never considered that an enemy might try to make their own ships uninhabitable rather than destroying them outright. "Life support failures across the fleet," came the panicked reports. "Atmospheric processors offline, environmental controls compromised." The humans weren't trying to destroy the Krextai ships. They were making them unlivable. Crew members began collapsing as their breathing apparatus failed. Temperature controls created freezing or burning conditions that forced evacuations. Water recycling systems introduced contaminants that caused immediate illness. "Surrender," David transmitted on the Krextai command frequency, his voice carrying a cold authority that made Zarath shiver. "Your fleet is dying by degrees. Your ships will become tombs unless you withdraw immediately." "You cannot do this," Vorthak responded, his usual arrogance replaced by desperation. "This violates every principle of honorable warfare." "Honor?" David's laugh was genuinely terrifying. "You threatened to commit genocide against defenseless colonists. You used diplomatic immunity to plan a sneak attack. You forfeited any claim to honor when you made this personal." Faced with the choice between watching his crews die slowly or retreating in humiliation, Vorthak chose survival. The Krextai fleet began withdrawing from both New Geneva and Velcarian space, leaving behind disabled ships and scattered pride. In the aftermath, as reports came in confirming the successful evacuation of New Geneva and the retreat of the Krextai forces, Zarath found herself alone with the husband she no longer recognized. "How long have you been living this double life?" she asked quietly. David was carefully packing away his military equipment, his movements precise and efficient. "Since before we met." The cultural attaché position was real, but it was also cover for military liaison duties. Humans needed someone who could coordinate our defensive capabilities with allied governments without revealing their full extent. "So everything has been a lie." "No," David said firmly, turning to face her. "Zarath, I love you. I love our life together. Our quiet evenings, the garden, the poetry we read together. That's not fake. That's who I am when I don't have to be this." He gestured toward the communication equipment, his expression softening for the first time in hours. "I hoped you would never have to see this side of me. I hoped the galaxy was peaceful enough that I could just be your husband, not a soldier." Zarath studied his face, seeing both the gentleman she had married and the dangerous stranger who had just orchestrated a military victory. "Which one is real?" "Both," David replied. "Humans contain multitudes, Zarath. We can be peaceful gardeners and efficient killers. We can write poetry about love and devise tactics to destroy our enemies. The capacity for both is what makes us human." He moved closer, his expression vulnerable in a way she recognized. "The question is whether you can accept both sides of me." Zara thought about the past year, about David's kindness to the palace children, his gentle care for injured creatures, his genuine love for art and beauty. Then she thought about the cold efficiency with which he had dismantled the Krextai threat, protecting not just her people, but innocent human colonists who would have died without his intervention. The Krextai called humans weak, she said finally. They couldn't have been more wrong. David's smile was the one she recognized, gentle, warm, and full of love for her. But now she also saw the steel underneath, the hidden strength that her enemies would never see coming. No, he agreed. They really couldn't. As they stood together in the aftermath of the crisis, Zareth realized that she had fallen in love with only half of her husband. Now that she knew the whole truth, she found herself loving him even more. David was living proof that true strength sometimes wore a gentle face, and that the most dangerous predators were those who never seemed threatening until it was far too late. The galaxy would learn, as the Krextai had learned, that humans were much more than they appeared. And at the center of the Velcarian Empire, a princess who had thought she married a harmless poet now knew she had wed a warrior who simply preferred peace to war. It was, she reflected, exactly the kind of husband a future empress needed.